So I appreciate there's been quite a lot of content on viability and cost, deconstruction, fabrication, etc. So hopefully we'll be covering a few of the old grounds, but with a more of a cost focus. So do bear with me if it's a little bit, it's a bit repetitive. But we'll cover this. So first of all, just a quick introduction to Vibe Quantity Surveyors. So we're a boutique PQS firm that specialises in central London developments, predominantly private development, and we're quite a new name in the industry. We just celebrated our first birthday, so that's why you might not have heard of us just yet. However, because of our focus and our experience being commercial, this presentation is slightly more geared towards central London developments and commercial, but we will cover a bit later on with Segro and with Elliott Wood how the principles can be applied to other building typologies, but you'll still see some common themes that can be applied across different projects. So there is a preconception within the market that steel reuse is cheaper than buying new steel. You know, you're not buying lots of new materials, so why would it be more expensive? That's not always the case. There are some hidden cost uplifts that aren't always known to start with, depending on how it's implemented in a project, and that can cause cost premiums. There's also a lack of cost fixity that can be obtained earlier on, and as we know of our clients, that can make people a bit nervous and they can be barriers put up. So what we want to do here is try and identify where those premiums are, how we can collectively work together more efficiently to try and identify those, alleviate those, and therefore make it less cost prohibitive. Now, the very nature of steel reuse, circular economy, and refurbishment projects they are extremely bespoke. Every project's different, and therefore we don't have a one-size-fits-all. So I'm going to put on the screen rates here. You might disagree with them. They might not apply to your project, they might not be proportional to your project. That's totally fine. What this is doing is highlighting costs for, say, an average project, and it's really starting those conversations, because then you can have better, more well-informed conversations with everyone within the supply chain and hopefully then make more informed decisions. So please do challenge me, just not too hard at the end. So let's get started. So first of all, let's start with the material price itself. So new steel really depends on the section type. So at the moment, currently we're seeing a selling price of new steel work between £900 and £1,000 a tonne. Now that is based on a typical structural section, probably more geared towards category A and B sections. If you're looking at C and D, it's going to be a bit higher. Now it is worth noting that since January 2026, the costs have increased by circa £300 to £400. And that is largely attributed to the Iran conflict and energy prices. And it is expected to further increase, or there is speculation that it will further increase, again relating to Iran, and that's very much based on the deal that's being done at the moment, but also the tariffs that will be coming in July. And that starts to demonstrate the volatility of the market. And as Roy mentioned earlier, steel as a commodity, it is impacted by geopolitical events and outside influences. Some of them are here on the screen. You've got your raw material costs, scrap costs, global supply and demand, electrical prices, transportation, and the dreaded word tariffs. But just to join the dots for you, when I say the current selling price is £900 to £1,000, that's typically what we'll get from our supply chain. What we then put into our cost plans and what clients see is a fully fabricated piece of steel that's been delivered to site, installed with various labour and overheads. So I'd say, as a rule of thumb, the material price is attributed or accounts for about 25% of the overall installed steel work. But again, very much dependent on the type of steel that's being installed. So Roy did a good job of mentioning earlier about how some of the prices can change. I've then shown it diagrammatically to try and help my explanation. So as you can see here, I've plotted the typical structural steel selling price over the last 6 or 7 years or so. I've also then put in the UK's average scrap steel price, so you can start to see the relationship between the two. And as you can see, they do follow the similar trends. As we've already mentioned, it's extremely volatile, and you can see that because it's impacted by some of the geopolitical events, on the right-hand side, I've got some of these here. So in 2020, we had COVID. That created a temporary collapse of the steel market. In 2021, we had a strong recovery, and that drove commodity prices up. We've then 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. That drove an energy crisis, and we saw costs jump quite significantly. Following that, we've had a couple of years where demand slowed, which I would say largely is attributed to what we're seeing activity-wise in the market, predominantly in central London. And we've also seen a bit of an increase in terms of imported steel. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2026, we've seen a bit of an increase relating to what's going on in Iran. So I think it's very important here just to note that with costs of steel prices moving around quite fluidly, it's very important to be very close to the supply chain to constantly check cost plan assumptions, what's in appraisals and budgets, because where it's moving, we need to also reflect what's going on in the market. So looking at the reclaimed steel, as we know, there's different routes to using reclaimed steel. You've got your steel stockist and you've got your donor building. For the purpose of this presentation, I've split the two because there are different cost considerations. So looking at the reclaimed steel, purchase prices are primarily impacted by scrap value. So what the steel stockist will look to do is purchase reclaimed steel just above the scrap value, as close to the scrap value as possible, because that means that if it's then not utilised and has to be scrapped later on, you're reducing your risk exposure by the amount you're paying over scrap. I think at the moment it's roughly at £50 a tonne over the scrap value, which is probably where you'll find it in the market, and that's a very probably one of the better places to be. But it is worth noting that material is procured speculatively, i.e. there's not a building that's identified and members are sought to be able to be used within that. And so as Roy mentioned, you can therefore have stock sitting around for a couple of years, and actually ultimately around 30% of it is then recycled. Now, the sell price typically follows the trend of the new steelwork. Obviously, in the market, it will need to fall slightly below the new steel because who's going to buy reused steel if it's more expensive than new? However, because it has a link to the new steel, it can also be fairly volatile. It's also worth noting that it does also depend who you're selling the steel to. The larger, say, tier one fabricators will have slightly more buying power and will be able to purchase steel at a slightly more economic price, potentially on the lower end of the range, about £100 a tonne cheaper. So I know what you're all thinking. Hang on, the steel stockers buy steel for just over scrap price and they sell it for a bit shy of new steel price. Why aren't we all doing reclamation of steel? Because it's a pretty good business model. Well, no, we obviously have to do a lot of processing to that steel work, and that's what then needs to be captured in between that price differential. So I've taken the graph that I showed you earlier, and I've plotted the indicative reused steel purchase price, which follows just above the scrap values. I've also then plotted the indicative reused steel selling price, which follows the trend of the new steel. And then in blue, I've shaded what the differential is, which is essentially what your margin is to do that processing. Now, that processing will have to cover transportation and storage, cleaning, removing of all the coatings and preparation, obviously the defabrication process, the steel testing that we spoke about earlier, the recertification and any other related documentation. Now, what you can see with this blue line is where you have new steel prices decrease, i.e. in 2020, that margin to do those works is very small. And so you have to be very selective on what steel is being defabricated. Where your new steel price increases, you've got a lot more margin to be able to undertake those works. And so you can probably you have a bigger range of what steel to fabricate and use within buildings. It's also worth noting that the steel isn't defabricated as it's bought into the stockyard. It's tagged and it's separated and put away. And therefore, you also have to take into account when you're buying it and when you're selling it. You could buy it at a time where scrap price is high, but only sell it when new steel price reduces, which again will further put pressure onto that margin. So looking at the donor side, again, as I mentioned earlier, you don't have the material price purchase costs, so that's eliminated. However, there are other cost considerations that you need to be aware of. We've spoken a bit today about the recovery and demolition, and I'll come on to that a bit later, but the careful dismantling and unbolting of steel does come at an additional cost. You're also, not all recoverable steel is usable, and so there is also a higher wastage. But there are some cost-effective recovery criteria that we can use to try and mitigate that cost uplift. And that generally, as a rule of thumb, is members greater than 40 kilograms a metre, in excess of 6 metre sections, UB457 and larger, and quantities grouped in batches, and that's more so for the testing. So you can test up to 20 tonnes at a time. So the nearer you get to 20 tonnes, the more efficient that process will be. Other key commercial considerations are that it does typically involve earlier engagement with the contractor. And double handling of materials can obviously increase costs. And it does alter your cash flow slightly, but I'll come on to that a bit later. There are certain steel conditions that aren't really economical to recover. So if it's excessively fabricated, if there's lots of drilling, and that will have to be required to be infilled later, and shear stud removal can range from 500 to 700 pounds a tonne. And so that's pretty much going to take out your whole margin of which you need to do the rest of the processing. So it's just worth noting that you need to be fairly selective with those members. Moving on to the demolition. So as I mentioned earlier, every project's very bespoke and specific. It also is the same for demolition costs. So the difference in demolition or dismantling is not only project specific, it's the steel connection details, access constraints, and very much the amount you're targeting for reuse. So as you can see here, I've put in a table what potentially the cost uplift for different levels of dismantling for reuse could be, with the baseline assuming you're basically crushing, cutting and scrapping that metal. So as you can see, as you then increase the target of which you're recovering for reuse, your premium can increase. But it's worth noting that that premium is based on the removal of steelwork only and not the whole demolition package, which could obviously include facade removal, glazing removal, slab breaking out. So that typically will just be on your percentage. And sorry, Severfield and Bourne, I've done the thing that you hate, and I've tried to translate that into a pound per tonne just so we can see on a comparable basis what that might mean. So I would say on an average for some partial steel recovery, it's sensible to assume 150 to 300 pounds a tonne additional or extra over to your demolition package. And that's largely driven by programme. It's typically longer to dismantle that steelwork, additional labour, you might need additional craneage, temporary supports as well. So I have a project where we looked at this, and we've spoken a bit before about even if you're not looking to put steel back into a donor building, is it the right thing to dismantle projects and put it back into circular economy so we can do this more readily? So the client wanted to do that. We looked to take off the top 2 levels of an existing building because they were rebuilding it with timber. And we actually asked the demolition contractor to price for careful dismantling of the steelwork. It was coming back at quite a significant premium. And once we unpicked it and fully understood that it was coming back as a premium of 15% on the whole demolition package, not just the steel reuse. And I think it was an extra over of £1,800 a tonne for the steel that was being removed. And the reason why is because it fundamentally changed the logistics and the methodology of the main contractor. They were bringing a tower crane in earlier, they needed a significant temporary support. And so actually it was really cost prohibitive. And so we moved away from that because, as with a lot of projects, viability was a challenge. And so that's what we need to start trying to understand, how we can do this, even when you're not reusing steel in a donor building or in another client building, to try and better the economy or the circular economy. So now looking at the defabrication and fabrication, I know we've just spoken about how that works, so I won't touch on it too heavily. However, I would say it's very much a trade-off with the costs and where they sit. You defabricate steel more extensively to a more like-new process. That's going to increase your defabrication costs. However, when it goes to the fabricator, it means that they can go through automated drill and saw lines as they would do with a new piece of steel, and that fundamentally then reduces the cost premium about fabrication. If we leave attachments on, or we don't grind the welds down to a certain agreed detail, then that then prevents that fabrication to be done in an automated way, and therefore things have to be done manually, which will have quite a big premium. If you imagine a steel fabricator on the shop will be a £40 an hour wage, that can quickly rack up if you're increasing time through a shop front for up to 4 hours, as Harry mentioned earlier. So it is very much a key trade-off. And whilst I think the majority of the room here are more structurally focused, it's also one to bring in the architects, because everyone has a different perception of what they want reused steel to look like. If you're happy to, have the little dints and holes in it tell a story, fine. But if you want it to be filled in and look like brand new, there's going to be a different cost associated with that. So I've kind of given you lots of theory about different applications, but to try and compare this in a like-for-like manner, I've put together some graphs, which I imagine are going to have a few comments on. It's worth noting that with this reuse steel for the donor site, I've taken out the variable of program doesn't quite work, it needs to sit in a warehouse or in storage for 4 years, because that then will just skew the numbers quite considerably. So please do note that will change the metrics. So if we look at new steel, I've plopped it in at £950, which is kind of the average of where I said earlier, and that will include your transport, testing, certification, so it's pretty much ready to go to the fabricators. Looking at the stocklist route, we buy the material at 300, which was where I showed in my graph earlier. Scrap's currently 250, so £50 extra, and then we start doing the processing, so the transport, defabrication, removing coating, testing, certification. Now, I've assumed that for the certification, the testing, that because the stockist has probably a wider access to steel, that probably could be batched up into 20-ton batches and it would be more efficient. So that's the assumption. And that gives us, on a percentage basis, as a material cost, about 11% of reduction on the new steel. The reuse for the donor site, again, similar principle, but I've assumed that with a donor site, you might have slightly less efficient batching up, and so that would be a slightly higher cost, but all the others are comparable, and that's showing a reduction of about 35% in your material costs. So fantastic. It is cheaper. For now. So moving on to the next stage of our process, and that's the fabrication. So new steel is all the same bars I've just shown have now been shaded into a brown colour, and then we look above that, so you've got the fabrication. Again, it's very heavily dependent on what you're doing to that steel work, but for the purpose of this, I've assumed, say, £1,600 for fabrication, engineering works to understand what needs to be done to it, and transport, so essentially ready to go to site and be installed by your subcontractor. Looking at the stockist route, the fabrication is less efficient when done with reused steel. And so that's, as I mentioned, you might have a bit of additional labour associated with it, but also you'll have some, the engineering aspect of it in the design will be slightly longer, where you look at how to orientate that beam so the penetrations work with the design. You might have to weld on some stubs because it's not quite the same length. So there'll be a bit more jiggery-pokery. And I think, speaking to some of the fabricators, they estimate it could be 10 to 20% uplift on your new steel beam when it goes to the fabrication shop. And it can take about 2 hours a tonne more to go through the shop. I've also assumed for this, so I've popped at the bottom, this is assuming a lower target reuse, so say 5, 10, up to 20%. And I'm assuming that if that's the case, a lot of the reuse can be done as a stock match as opposed to a member substitution. But I've assumed there might be some redesign work or some design work that needs to be done if it's done slightly later in the design phase and some checks have to be done. That's giving us a cost uplift of between 7 and 8% from the new steel route. And your donor site, exactly the same. However, I've assumed that because you've had a donor site and you've designed it with those member and those section types in mind, there'll be no extra design required. However, I have now included an uplift for the dismantling. That shows a near-on cost neutral, but a small uplift between 1 to 2%. So what happens if a client has sustainability on the agenda and they really want to push an increased target? Well, I would say in that case, your design will, on the stockist route, you might have to do more of a detailed assessment of stock. That might then involve some abortive design going back. If it's done earlier in the design stage, i.e. stage 3, you probably could mitigate that. If as we often do, it gets brought up during a PCSA with the main contractor and you've got a stage 4 design, that will then need to be revised because the structural engineer will want to obviously embed that as part of their design before it goes into contract. So I've assumed in that case, you'd have a bigger uplift on your design. And then with your donor site, again, I've assumed that you might need to do a bit more work with the redesign. And because we're doing more of a whole sale identification and recovery of steel within your existing building, your dismantling cost will also increase. So that shows us up nearly a 9 to 10% for the stockist route and a 5% for donor site. Now, at the start, I mentioned the volatility of new steel. So I don't want to just be doom and gloom. If the steel does increase, as we think it might do, particularly relating to the incoming tariffs, but not including the 50% tariff, because that's a whole different can of worms I don't quite want to get into right now, then we obviously have to see how that fares against the viability of reuse steel. So if I then increase the new steel material price to 1,300, I then increase the material price for the stockist, because as we know, it is linked to new steel work, but not proportionately. That actually then reduces the cost uplift or the premium associated with the stockist to say 3%. And we're actually seeing a reduction for the donor site because you don't have that existing material, and so there's more saving there. So it's playing around with how much materials are changing is going to be a variable. And I think with this, if you agree with the sentiment behind it, disagree with it, all I'm going to say is you've got your variable of material prices. It's important to take into account. Your design, when are you embedding this principle into your design? Is it early on? Is it stage 3? And then any member substitutions can be embedded throughout that design? Or is it at stage 4 when we're in a rush trying to get into contract with the main contractor? Then maybe some abortive design works. You then have the material that's being used. What's the condition of the existing steel? What is the defabrication cost? And what is expected of that reused steel, i.e. does it need to look like new, or are we happy to embrace some of the penetrations and holes that are already there? Also, the dismantling, again, is another project variable. So these are the things to be aware of when discussing it, and hopefully that kind of gives you an indication of how all of these moving parts can impact the overall cost of the construction cost. So moving on to design, and I won't cover this too much because you're probably a lot better placed to talk about design than I am. But a couple of notes just where it impacts commerciality. Obviously, if you're looking to review existing stock and where something isn't available, you upsize a member to ensure that you're meeting the structural requirements. That is not to teach anyone to suck eggs, it means a bigger beam or a bigger column, more weight, more cost. So it is just worth noting that obviously not only do you lose a bit of efficiency, but there will be additional costs associated with it. Similarly, if you've got deeper beams, that may impact ceiling heights, which is not just for the architecture review. A lot of our projects do have minimum ceiling heights that we have to achieve for tenancy, so it can also impact the value piece. As I mentioned, filling in holes will have a cost impact, and the amount of steel that is being targeted for reuse will impact the design costs as well. And so for this, I'd really say that earlier in the design process that you can embed it, the more efficient it will be, the more you can mitigate program pressures, and the more you can mitigate these cost uplifts as well. So moving on to procurement, I would say conventional procurement, typically the stage 4 design or the design will be progressed largely independently of the final steel supplier. And there won't really be any commitment to cost with the steel until you get into contract with the main contractor. Whereas when we look at reuse steel, early contractor involvement is really imperative for it to be successful. And so that changes the metrics slightly. Now that can be done under PCSA, but it's worth noting that that will incur a PCSA fee. Now, you might also say that's completely worth it, but from someone that advises clients, this is worth noting that there's going to be some additional expenditure and pre-contract expenditure. And also PCSA fees, or PCSAs in principle, can limit the competitive or the ability to competitively tender that later on. And so it's not necessarily about going to main contractors, steel subcontractors to do that exercise, whilst that might bring benefit, depending on what your project brief and your key drivers are. Is there a way that you can speak directly to the stockist to ensure that exercise is done, but still maintain that ability to tender it competitively later? As I mentioned, you might have some earlier cost commitment, i.e. to secure materials, to test it, to do some validation or design work. So not necessarily a bad thing, but it will just alter your cash flow profile. And traditionally, some of the risks that typically will be main contractor owned, i.e. sourcing of materials, logistics, storage, transport, actually is brought forward. So again, it just alters the risk profile when you're looking at procurement. However, I'm not going to just completely say all the negatives. As we are clearly aware, there is market steel price volatility in the market. And so by utilising reused steel, you can help eliminate that exposure to risk. And so I think that is definitely a key item of which we should be aware of. But there are all different routes of which to do that in. So finally, before I get my fellow panelists up and stop talking at you, I would say the key is that steel reuse can, in principle, significantly reduce material costs. However, I think a lot of the time in practice, defabrication, dismantling, bringing it into the process too late, working in silos can have cost uplifts, and that actually can offset part of the savings. So there's potential there, but we're probably just not quite there at the moment, and there is generally a bit of nervousness about it in the market. But early planning is critical to maximise that value and also make sure that it stays on the agenda as we go through the process. There indefinitely cost uplifts, and clients then start to move away from that because meeting the budget that's being signed off becomes more attractive. So it's trying to do it early and make sure that that's maintained throughout the process. We all do need to work together, and so working in silos does not work. So if we need to stay close to the supply chain, supply chain needs to stay close to us and the end users, so then we can help understand where things are moving in the market, what developments there are, and that we can all respond to that accordingly. And finally, project-specific analysis is essential. As I've mentioned quite a few times, this is to give you a guide. Please do reach out to various parties to talk about your project specifics, because they will be different, but it doesn't mean that some of these issues won't be coming up. And finally, embodied carbon reductions obviously is an agenda for the whole industry. And not only is there a construction cost uplift, there is, no doubt, can be a big value to it as well. So we'll cover that shortly with Frank from GPE about how you can have intangible benefits and values to the reuse strategy as well. So that's everything from me for now. I'd just like to thank some people that have helped me out, because I'm not a steel expert and I've had to go on a bit of a steep learning curve to understand the principles behind it. So I've had a few helpful guidance. So I do want to say thank you, and I will welcome everyone else up.
Are you going to sit in the right order? Should we go this way?
Oh, I'm going over here, unless you want to be Charlotte for today.
We're all different.
So Frank, not to throw you completely under the bus straight away, but since it was a nice segue, I've just mentioned obviously that there can be cost increases associated with the reused steel, but from an outfit such as GP, it's obviously really big on your agenda, and you've done it really successfully. Can you just start to explain some of the other key value points that you see in it, as opposed to just a cost-saving exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Frank, part of the sustainability team at GPE. The project...
Sorry, Frank, I'm terrible at this. Should we just introduce everyone?
That's all right. Yeah, that's me.
George from Elliotwood, Director, Structural Engineer.
And Chris from CSUK26 on the sort of delivery development side.
As you were.
Easy. The project obviously you're talking about is 2 Aldermanbury Square and 30 Duke Street, which I think has been mentioned a few times today, and there's probably half of the people in the room that have been involved with the project in some shape or form. It wouldn't have been achievable without supply chain engagement, and obviously that is another huge intangible that's been achieved by the project. You know, we never really decided to go through that steel reuse journey because of cost. It wasn't even really through sustainability. So my director, Janine, she sits on our executive committee. The project was actually taken to the executive committee for sign-off without her knowledge. So, which is great when, you know, project directors and development managers bring sustainability ideas to the table, and they'd been able to bring it to the execco because of the, I think, long-term relationships that we've got with our engineering team, the main contractors, the fabricators, and everybody that's sort of been around the table and on the stage today. We think, and we're still trying to get to grips with some of where we probably sit on cost. And Charlotte, you've mentioned it already. The donor site obviously bears a lot of the brunt of that. Keltbray did a fantastic job on the deconstruction of the project, but obviously there was an uplift there. You look at it in terms of the overall build cost, I think we're probably about 1% of the overall build cost in additional for deconstruction. And then on the 30 Duke Street side, which is the recipient, you've got the material fixity, as you've already said, but you've probably got additional consultancy costs. We've got the additional testing, and it was a lessons learned for a lot of people on that project. So, you know, and there was a lot of goodwill put into that. But in terms of some of the intangibles that we've now been able to sort of take forward, I think the key one for us is probably on the planning front. Yep. We've been able to open up great relationships with Westminster, obviously where the project sat. At the time, the retrofit first policy was sort of embryonic, but we knew it was coming, and that's helped us, you know, understand ourselves how we can deliver against that policy, and also work with Westminster on it. The Crown are the freeholder on the development, and we probably wouldn't have got the development agreement over the line without the circularity story, without the steel reuse story. So again, that was a really positive thing. And then finally, again, this is not really something, you know, and I've talked about it upstairs in one of the round tables, you know, we're trying to pull on different levers at different times for this kind of stuff. The market conditions obviously were right at the time, maybe not so much at the moment, but we're also trying to, you know, pull on the customers, the end users of our buildings. We had a pre-let in there, which is great. Probably not because of the circularity, probably because of where it sits. It's great office, it's prime office. But actually the steel that was reused has allowed that building to have column-free floor plates. So the customer came in and went, yeah, this looks fantastic. This is exactly what we want. So again, another sort of intangible or additional benefit that we've seen through doing the project.
Brilliant. So, Chris, I appreciate you've obviously been doing some really good work in this space. And when we were talking previously, you mentioned that you see some different challenges, not only just with commercial, but more procurement and timing. So do you want to give everyone a bit of an update on how you utilise it in terms of what building typology you do and some of the challenges that you're seeing to try and make this more widely used?
I guess just worth setting context in terms of why we're looking at it. I suppose we're not looking at it as a cost saving. We've set ourselves some fairly ambitious embodied carbon targets, and we've done quite well against those up and recently. We're now starting to look forwards over the next sort of 4, 5, 6 years, and there becomes a pinch point in a couple of years' time where our standard building typology, and we've used a lot of EAF up to date, and then across our European portfolio, kind of use timber and a number of other materials. But we need to do something to up our game and to help us continue down that path. I think we also kind of believe we've got a real opportunity. We've got a lot of our developments that are coming forwards now, certainly in our London portfolio, have an existing estate, an existing kind of number of buildings. They come down to put new ones up. A lot of the time, we're redeveloping not massively increasing floor area. We're changing kind of geometry or heights of buildings and reorganising estates to meet kind of current industrial demand. But what it means is there's the similar amount of steel coming out as going in. So I think we're, on the face of it, got a really good opportunity. The big issue we're having is kind of timing and how we generally procure. We often will procure off a kind of early stage 3 in reality, or mid stage 3. So it's very early design. And then as soon as that goes out the door, we are kind of running very quickly to site. So we really struggle with that early engagement piece. And we really struggle to make any sort of financial commitment before a pre-let, at which point it's going as quick as we can to site. So we're struggling with the early engagement and the level of design we go to. So we're starting to look at whether we need to rejig how we design, do we need to take our design further, and how we can unpick that piece, which is what we're doing a lot of work with Elliot Wood on. But it's a different challenge that we've got for sure.
Yeah, because I'd say that typically in commercial development, we'll always push to develop something to stage 4 before we tender it to try and get more cost certainty, less risk moving into the construction phase. So it's definitely doing it at that stage is going to be a challenge.
Ultimately, I think we are, sheds aren't very complicated. We know how much a shed is going to cost. The risk is in the ground, and we can understand that. So we don't need to take the design to that level of stage 4. But if we're looking at something in reused steels or looking at using a donor building, we need to somehow bring those together.
Brilliant. And George, you kind of cover all different building typologies. What stage in the design do you typically will reuse start being considered? And do you think that, say, the commercial buildings could learn more from what Segro are doing, vice versa?
I think Laura might have touched on it as well already. From the very start with the archives, with the understanding the building, the donor building, whether it's an existing building on site or another building in the portfolio, we're absolutely thinking about what can we do here to reuse that material successfully. I think with commercial world, and Duke Street's a really good example, you can be a little bit more opportunistic and you can have those conversations. There's space for them in the design program. The client in this case wanted that conversation to happen where you explore stories of, can we reuse the whole building? Do we need it all? Where's it going to go if it doesn't go into our building? And we know the outcome of that is we've got a really good product, but actually there's other buildings that are coming out of that. Whereas with you guys, it's much more compact, and actually you can't afford that opportunistic time to kind of just go on then, go and have a little explore for a couple of months. It doesn't work like that. And actually it needs to be a much more established kind of timeline from the outset. And to be fair, you're at the very start of that journey, and we kind of completed something with GP. So it's kind of, there's the two sides. And I think even going back again, referencing Laura's point, I think we put some thought pieces out there, a circularity guide sponsored by Grosvenor, and I think they were doing lots of little projects where then we were looking at 10 tonnes of steel reuse was exciting and successful. And look at us now, we're talking about hundreds of tonnes. And then the next one, hopefully, is thousands of tonnes. And that's where we'll be going, but it started with 10. It didn't start with the big one, it started with small tests and, you know, us playing around. We didn't even know who Cleveland were the first time. You know, now we do.
Yeah.
But, you
Block
know,
your ears.
Is Roy here? Yeah, so I think there's very different angles to take when you're looking at the different sectors and the different mindsets, let alone if you're an independent developer and you don't have an estate and you don't have donors and so on.
I'm going to put a bit of a controversial question out there. Do you think there's enough transparency with regards to costs and commercial side of building or construction projects that is inhibiting, genders like reuse?
I'll go first. I think there is a presumption that actually it's more expensive in the London market at the moment, unless someone's got something that they want to reuse.
Yeah.
I think it's just de facto. And then it comes back to my point, is there that space for opportunistic conversation? Should we have a look and see if there is some steel to reuse, and can we make it a cheaper process? Well, it's not that it's the steel sits there and exists every time. And that's part of the problem. I think it's an intangible that everyone gets very uncomfortable about. We want certainty and we want clarity, and we can't really commit to that yet.
Yeah, it's a different model, especially with certain funders that don't want to be expending anything pre-contract without that security that something's going to be going forward. So you've got to be the right model and the right client to be able to embrace that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a case in point with GPE. It's serendipity that the project in the city was coming down. I mean, we actually looked at that to refurb that building. We went through the whole process, and I think someone was talking about pre-demolition or pre-redevelopment orders before. That was how we understood that it was over-engineered and that steel was there to be utilised. Yeah. And then having the right people and the right teams. Again, on both projects to have those conversations, whether, and as George says, whether it be talking to Cleveland or talking to EMR at the time, and then obviously talking to Hares, who we're going to put up the building at Duke Street. I think it was perfect timing, and you know, George and I were talking about this before. Would we do Duke Street again with the full reuse and reclamation? Probably not. Or probably I say definitely not. It's to Laura's point. It's about not. You know, we recognise now that steel is probably better suited elsewhere.
Yeah.
Would we design it with new steel in the same way? No, because it wasn't optimum. But we would look to add those layers on, and I think it was the session right at the start. It was about, you know, utilising timber, utilising reuse, utilising AAF, all of the weapons in your arsenal, because it's not just about steel reuse.
Yeah, it's a combination.
So yeah, I mean, it just happened, and obviously, like George said, we've got the rents there to be able to play around a little bit and, you know, trial it and, you know, let people learn.
Just to add, some narrative to that, the point about you said about it drove the design, in that the original scheme was a standard commercial scheme for the West End. The grids were optimum for an efficient building in the West End. Suddenly we're doing 12-metre spans overnight because the donor building had 14-metre spans. We didn't expect that. Yeah. Suddenly you've got a better product, and so you're overpaying slightly to do the reclamation, but actually you're delivering a better product and you can attract better tenants. Of course we didn't set out to do that. I'd be lying if I said we did, but it's such a great story in the round that why wouldn't you do it? So that's kind of the full picture.
Do you think there should be something in the industry or government to better incentivise clients to dismantle their buildings, irrespective of whether they're using the reused steel? Because as I mentioned earlier of my example, the client wanted to do that, but it was cost prohibitive, and so it ended up getting chopped down and recycled. This is a completely open question. I just feel like with it always coming down to cost, which a lot of things do, and when you have over budget projects, it's going to be the first thing to go.
And kind of back to your point on clarity as well, I think for us they tie together. I think where we've looked at dismantling without necessarily having a kind of a future use for that, we're then trying to demonstrate internally that uplifting cost is worthwhile.
Yeah.
And actually we need to try and tell that whole story and try and kind of give the picture on the broader industry, which for a business like ours is quite tricky. And I think as with everyone, we kind of viability is key, and in those early design stages when we don't know what the customer's going to be, rents are, we don't quite know where they're going to land, we need to keep projects as tight as we can. And actually one of the other challenges, I guess, with the way we procure and often demolish 6 months, a year before we build, we're then, if we're looking to reuse or sell to a stockist, it kind of changes our cash flow quite a lot.
Yeah.
And actually massively increases our upfront spend before we've got a secured development, and that does make us nervous, and kind of in the kind of justification up to board, that becomes a tricky conversation.
Exactly, and I think it's a conversation we all too often have, and you can't underestimate how much viability is still an issue in our industry. We've had some really big inflation over the last five or so years, and that's really putting pressure on viability. So we can't underestimate how much projects are struggling to be viable, let alone with these premiums and, you know, things that people, not me, don't quote me, deem to be a nice to have, i.e. a funder, it's going to be a hard sell. Who don't necessarily understand it, they could be offshore.
And certainly in our kind of more central London portfolio, where our schemes are not sort of typical warehouses, we're being pushed on kind of a number of other areas that are already massively inflating our construction costs, and we're trying to build warehouses that fit in with residential, and we're going way, way beyond where we normally would, to then overlay kind of reuse or even push the sustainability agenda at all. We can't do it. We're already so for us it's kind of outer London and edges of London and beyond in the big box stuff that there's probably a bit more potential for it. Yeah. But it is very site dependent.
I'd agree. Anything else from anyone before I go to the questions? I've been putting it off because I don't want to see what they are.
There was I can't remember which session it was. There's a question that didn't get asked about City of London versus Westminster. Which one was hungrier for whoever asked that? Interesting question. But relating to this conversation, obviously the London plan is pushing for carbon numbers and reuse and demonstration that you're keeping buildings and etc. It works very well if you're trying to do new build here and you need something to do to kind of add to that story. It does work and it's going to help your carbon numbers massively. And we know that Phoenix and Bureau Happold have done an amazing job there with that building and reused the floors. That's what you get. You get really interesting projects. And that's central London though. That isn't kind of outside of London where the London plan isn't there being applied and you haven't got those incentives. So they're not financial incentives, but there is another thing. And then on top of that is the incentives from ESG and investors and up the chain. And I don't know how clear that is to designers these days and contractors, but I'm seeing a lot of them pushing for a greener agenda. But whether we're reporting the opportunities back through the development managers, I think that should be more transparent.
There's also a lot of pressure for a greener agenda, but without any
cost.
They want the kind of greener credentials, but not necessarily willing to pay for it. And we don't really think against any of our ESG credentials there's much of an uplift in rent, if anything. They might rent a little bit quicker, but we don't think there's an uplift.
Yeah, and I think people who assume that there's not going to be a cost uplift relating to all of these items, it's not the case. You know, as we know, the ESG agenda, sustainability agenda has increased quite significantly. We've seen a massive shift in price points, particularly on construction costs for commercial developments to allow for those. And so I think, you know, it's a shift in the market. It's now an expectation with tenants, but it has come at a cost premium, and therefore a lot of our benchmark projects still fall slightly short, even if they've recently PC'd because they were designed 5-6 years ago. This is why I was putting it off. Right, let's have a look. Emerald Steel said deconstruction didn't really cost more. Is that because they were talking more about sheds rather than city centre commercial buildings? I don't want to speak on behalf of Emerald Steel, but I would say potentially that is the reason. It's the application. It really does depend on how the building's being constructed and the connection details. You know, you look at London and you've got really tight logistics, and so it does alter your methodology and obviously programme quite significantly. Remember, programme means prelims means more money. So I think it really does depend on the application, and I imagine, yes, that's probably why they're not seeing as much of an impact, or that it all naturally is dismantled anyway because of the nature it was put together.
I would say even though on sheds we are seeing an uplift in demo costs.
Okay, well.
Probably not as significant,
yeah.
But kind of if we're just taking it down to scrap it, we're pretty brutal about it and can just drive in with a big machine, whereas if we are taking it down gently, it does increase time, not as significantly, but it does.
I mean, there's a couple of examples that I've seen on projects I'm working on where demo contractors that can do enabling works are opportunistically, the cost of the demo is not being passed on to the company that demolishing. They are taking a hit on it because they have got an opportunity to reuse that material somewhere else. Yeah. And they are providing that benefit back to the developer. So we've got a project where they brought that to us, and we didn't necessarily set out for reuse steel. We'd like it, but we didn't think that there was enough demand on the project. But we've got a full reuse scheme because that enabling works contractor was taking that gamble that they're taking down a building, they've got something to do with it, something to do with it in the future. And that's great to see. That's an innovation didn't see coming. How many more people can do that? How many times can they repeat it?
That's what I was going to, repeatability of it, you would expect the costs to fall as people get used to it and all this sort of stuff. And like George said, it's about being flexible to those options. Oh, lost your mic.
Oh no, it's good. You carry on talking. Buy me some time.
Buy you some time. I mean, and we talked about this upstairs. If it's additional time, if it's additional cost, it has to be paid for, and that's, you know, it's right to do that. But as I say, I think as it gets more efficient, people understand it more, it gets, you know, it becomes more BAU. Yes, you would hope that those costs come down.
Yeah, and there is, if it's not readily done, there is a nervousness about it. As Harry quite rightly mentioned before, as from a PQS perspective, we want everything to be fixed cost. We don't want changes and design changes to come back to the client later on. So if we're asking people to take on that risk, then we expect there to be a risk price within their numbers. And so I think it's that level of unknown and that level of not having cost certainty or fixity will drive nervousness and ultimately drive more risk premiums within numbers. I haven't been given 5 minutes, like, let me pick some good ones out. If a demolition contractor was working on a donor site, would you expect them to increase their cost to compensate for loss of scrap revenue? Yes. They will typically, a demolition contractor will price and they'll factor in scrap values within their tender. If we're taking that away from them, that offset will need to be factored in. So yes, I would do. If reuse does cost more, are there some obvious ways, opportunities to make savings to improve the viability? I mentioned previously what some of the cost premiums or potential variables are. I think it's understanding those and embedding the process or the redesign into your design early. I think it's also worth noting that if there's an acceptance that it might cost more, but it does drive value, i.e. less columns, more NIA, more rentable space or flexibility that can be translated into value, then a client might be happy to pay that premium. So I think it's not necessarily about reducing costs so it's cost neutral or saving. People or certain clients will be happy with a slight cost uplift, or the embodied carbon. Actually, what do we have to do to get the embodied carbon down elsewhere? Recycled aluminium content in facades, low carbon drywall, that all recycled raised access floors. These things also have costs. So it's also understanding which ones are going to have the bigger impact on your embodied carbon number and which ones have the price tags to match, because what you want to be doing is targeting the high saving of embodied carbon is the most cost efficient than going out and buying a really bespoke recycled terrazzo floor that's £1,000 a square metre in your WCs. You might not be getting much saving in carbon for it, so you might be wanting to pay 10% extra on your fit steel. It has to be looked collectively. Yeah. Right, guys, anything on that one? In terms of...
No, I mean, you said it.
There's one which says, is there a cost premium you're willing to pay for reused steel versus new, which is a percentage? I'm assuming that's a nice little GPE one, I think.
You're willing to pay for reused versus new as a percentage.
So it's quite dependent.
Yes, it depends on the project. I think you've just outlined it there. It's about having all, carbon program cost. We add, we've got a bit of a circularity metric in there now as well. So that all comes together. It's about putting them all on the table and seeing which is the biggest bang for your buck, really. Mm-hmm. So. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we want everything. We want our cake and eat it. So it's all about pulling pressures.
It's balancing the equation, isn't it? That's
right. Okay. Anything else? I think we've run out of time. Got 1 minute left.
I'm trying to read them all.
You've got questions on your graphs.
Oh no, I don't want to answer those.
Do Roy or Jonathan want to talk about Charlotte's graphs?
No, please don't. I'll blame them that they gave me some input. Very keen to hear Roy and Jonathan's view on the graphs. Thank you, Roy. Has he stormed out yet? No, I know, but I was saying, you said it's very good, so I'm taking that and moving quickly before you change your mind. And I've asked, is Roy stormed out yet, or are we... He's not here. Great. So in that case, very good. That's your answer. Thanks, Jonathan. Great help. Right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you guys for joining me here. Hopefully giving you guys a bit of an insight in some of the commercial sides, which I'm sure not all of you get to partake in those conversations when you're busy designing away and fabricating, etc. So thank you very much. Right.